I'm so terribly sorry. I was just reading here from my favorite book. Did you know that during the age of Jackson you would learn about a man by the name of Andrew Jackson? I certainly did not. Now, if you wouldn't mind, I would like to continue reading through this wonderful, wonderful book. And if you don't mind as well, perhaps you could follow along with me. Now, a couple of things. You will learn that Andrew Jackson, the first person from the American West to be elected president, was also during the opportunity to be about America's first age of reform. Many historians view Jackson's presidency as a turning point in the progress of American democracy. It was the era of the common man, marked by the growth of the involvement of an average citizen in public life. It was also a time when Native Americans were forced west with the threat of a secession to be avoided. Now, a couple of key things that you may want to highlight or underline. Andrew Jackson. Who would have thought? Henry Clay. The Battle of New Orleans. The Age of a Common Man. The Spoils System. Ding, 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 ding. Jacksonian Democracy. The Indian Removal Act. Ding, 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 ding. Worcester versus Georgia. The Trail of Tears. The Nullification Crisis. Ding, 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 ding. John C. Calhoun. The Compromise Tariff. The Industrial Revolution. Mass-produced. Eli Whitney. Interchangeable parts. Horace Mann. Kind of sounds like a horse who's also a man. The Second Great Awakening. Abolitionists. The Seneca Falls Convention. Ding, 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 ding. Elizabeth C. Stanton. Susan B. Anthony. Dorothea Dix. And the Temperance Movement. Essential questions are as follow. What was the Jacksonian democracy? How did Jackson's policies affect the political and economic and social life of the nation? And how did the social and economic life change as the United States began to move from an agrarian or farming community to an industrial society? We'll begin with the man himself, Andrew Jackson. Now, the presidency of Andrew Jackson was between 1829 and 1837. In 1824, General Andrew Jackson, the hero of the War of 1812, won the popular vote but fell short enough of votes in the Electoral College to win the election. The contest was decided in the House of Representatives, which selected John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams, as president. When Adams later appointed Speaker of the House Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson accused of Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain. Ding, 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 ding. The Democratic Republicans split between the supporters of Jackson, who called themselves Democrats, and his opponents, who called themselves Whigs. And don't be alarmed, this is not a Whig. The age of Jackson. A native of Tennessee, Andrew Jackson was not born into wealth. He defeated British forces at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. Later, he spent several years fighting Native Americans in Florida as well as Georgia. After his defeat in the election of 1824, here comes a tear. Jackson and his supporters spent the next 4 years campaigning for presidency. They introduced new campaign tactics, like the popular rallies, parades, and nominating conventions. The age of the common man. Jackson was finally elected president in 1828. His supporters were among the common people, laborers, farmers, and frontiersmen, like myself. Jackson saw himself as a spokesman for the common man, the average American. The inauguration. Jackson invited the public to visit the White House for his inauguration. A crowd of 20,000 people, many in muddy boots, passed along the building. Some broke glassware and china dishes in their struggle to get refreshments. The expansion of democracy. Jackson's 2 terms in office saw an expansion of American democracy. There was a time in which governments were changing their requirements for voting. When the Republic was founded, most states required white adult males to own some property in order to vote. Now the property qualifications was lifted. And I wonder why. Considering this president was not born into wealth, so he probably didn't see a whole lot of his own property to begin with. Just saying. Common man. If you would, take time to read through the little bit of a grayed out boxes with 3 inside of it. That way you understand what those are. And it is about the democratic changes under Jackson, which are the voting rights, the choosing of a president, and the campaign methods. So please take time to read through that. The spoils system. Ding, 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 ding. I forgot that, so there you go. Jackson believed the president should act as the voice of the common people. To make government more responsive to popular needs, Jackson favored the spoils system. Supporters who helped in the election campaign were appointed to the government posts in place of existing officials. Epic page flip. Jackson believed in changing office holders to give average citizens more experience in government. He felt circulating government posts were less likely to lead to government corruption and abuse than reliance on permanent government officials after their election. Other presidents had replaced some government officials, but Jackson did so on a much larger scale than before. Jacksonian democracy. Historians often refer to the end of the property qualifications, the spoils system, and the new forms of government campaigning as Jacksonian democracy. Politics became an activity of ordinary citizens. Jackson was a Westerner, a man born outside of the upper class of society. Jackson believed that the nation had been corrupted by special interest. He despised the wealthy, privileged bankers, investors, and merchants of the Northeast. His wife's death, which he blamed on the attacks of his opponents, added to his bitterness. Jackson and Native American Indians. Before becoming president, Jackson had served on the frontier, fighting the Creeks and the Seminoles, which were both Indian groups. Jackson believed that the Native American tribes might ally with foreign invaders and therefore proposed a danger to the nation. In 1817, he negotiated the removal of Eastern Cherokees in exchange for lands further west. He further believed that the Indian Removal Act was the only way for Indians to preserve their traditions and maintain a separate identity. One of Jackson's first acts as president was to propose the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was to remove all tribes still east of the Mississippi. Under this proposal, the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, 5 groups of Indian tribes, would trade their lands for new lands west of the Mississippi in a location called a reservation, which is above Texas and Oklahoma. Just letting you know. In addition, the federal government would provide them with money, rifles, and provisions for a year. Most of the tribes signed new treaties with the federal government. Based on their accomplishments, the Cherokees rejected Jackson's proposal. When the state of Georgia tried to remove them, the Cherokees took their case to the United States Supreme Court. In the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, they claimed they were an independent nation, protected by a treaty. John Marshall held that the tribe was a dependent nation, subject to federal, but not state, law. The Cherokees won their case, and Jackson was determined to remove them anyways. Basically, he was a sore loser. He concluded a treaty with some Cherokee tribe members, giving them 2 years to relocate to Oklahoma. Worcester versus Georgia. Meanwhile, Georgia passed a law in 1830 stating that any white person living among Indians without a license from the governor would be sent to prison. State legislators feared white missionaries were encouraging Indians to resist removal. Samuel Worcester, a missionary, was arrested and sentenced to prison for 4 years for living among the Cherokees. He sued to obtain his freedom. His case came before the United States Supreme Court in 1832. Cherokee leaders delayed moving. Ironically, because of this legal delay, the Cherokees were now forced to move in late fall and winter, when the weather had turned bitterly cold. Now, basically, they were fighting for their right. Now, whether you believe that they had one or they didn't, that's your opinion. Jackson saw that they had no right to stay and that he would see them move. Now, the problem is the Cherokee, with their delayments, were forced to move during one of the harshest winters that we'd ever seen up to that point, which causes a serious situation to take hold. In 1837, federal troops were called in to escort 16,000 Cherokees to their new home in Indian Territory up in Oklahoma. 1/4 of them died. 1/4 died from exposure to the elements, starvation from lack of food, and fevers due to lack of medicine and the harsh trip during their march along the 800-mile journey known as the Trail of Tears. If you look on page 204, you will notice that there is a trail map. I suggest you take the time, read it, analyze it, and understand exactly what it's saying. I'll give you a few minutes to do that right now. All right, coming back to it. The nullification crisis. During Jackson's presidency, the nation faced a crisis arising out of the tariff issue and states' rights. You will recall that northern manufacturers favored a high tariff to protect their industries from foreign competition. Southern states, which sold cotton from other crops to England, opposed the high tariff. Now, the tariff of abominations. In the spring of 1828, Jackson's supporters demanded changes in the tariff rates proposed by President John Quincy Adams. To embarrass Adams, some members of the Congress increased duties on raw materials while lowering the tariff on manufactured textiles, displeasing both the South and Northeast. They thought the bill would be rejected, but it actually passed. The tariff of 1828 became known as the Tariff of Abominations. A leading spokesman against the tariff was Vice President John C. Calhoun. He secretly published the Exposition and Protest, which was an essay pronouncing the tariff unconstitutional. Calhoun argued that each state had the right to nullify or cancel said unconstitutional federal law in its own territory. Calhoun saw that the Union was a compact of states, a group of states. Calhoun's ideas surfaced again in 1830. A senator proposed the sales of public lands in the West be halted. Senator Hayne of South Carolina advanced Calhoun's nullification theory. Senator Daniel Webster denounced this theory, telling the state that the Union was not a compact of states, but the work of the American people. Webster saw that the American people as the creators of the federal Union. Webster also pointed out that the Constitution assigned the task of determining a law's constitutionality to the Supreme Court, not the states, which is correct. He ended his speech with the stirring words, "Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Several months later, the nation learned President Jackson's views when he confronted his Vice President John C. Calhoun with a toast to our federal union. It must be preserved. Calhoun replied with a toast, the Union, next to our liberty, most dear. They were very, very for what they had planned out, what they thought, their beliefs. South Carolina threatens to secede. In 1832, the new tariff lowered duties by 10%. South Carolina, believing the tariff was still too high, put Calhoun's nullification theory into practice. A state convention passed a law, the Ordinance of Nullification, voiding the tariff, banning the collection of its duties in South Carolina, and threatening to secede from the Union if the federal government tried to enforce it. Now, President Jackson immediately spoke out against the nullification, calling it nothing more than treason. He acted quickly by dispatching a U.S. naval ship to Charleston Harbor and ordered that the federal fortifications there be strengthened. To bolster Jackson, Congress responded with the Force Bill, giving the president the power to use military force against South Carolina. So basically, the whip's coming down hard on him. Jackson also issued a warning in his proclamation of the people of the South Carolina, which called resistance to federal law a form of treason. So he was completely against the idea of South Carolina seceding. He was against it. He did not want them to do it, and if they were going to do it, he would see them as a traitor to the United States. Henry Clay finally proposed a compromise through a reduction in tariffs over the next 10 years. Faced with the use of federal troops, South Carolina withdrew its nullification law and averted a national crisis. Jackson showed that despite his support for states' rights, he would use force to preserve the Union. Now, next up, Jackson declaring war on the bank. This is very important, so I suggest you make sure that you take a few minutes, catch yourself. When you're ready, let's move on. Now, as you, I assume, have taken the opportunity to pause the video and collect yourself, now we're going to move on. President Washington had introduced the national bank as part of Hamilton's financial plan. A second national bank had been chartered in 1816. Jackson greatly disliked the national bank, did not like it at all. He thought that it gave an unfair monopoly to wealthy moneyed interest in the Northeast. Basically, it was just a pawn for the Northeast to make more money. Although the bank was found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court in McCulloch versus Maryland, Jackson set out to eliminate it. When Jackson was re-elected president in 1832, he ordered the removal of the federal deposits from the national bank. The massive withdrawal of funds had the effect of crippling the national bank. Jackson ordered these funds to be placed into state banks, which he felt more agreeable to lending monies to farmers. When it came up to the renewal, Jackson refused to renew the national bank's charter. Although many Americans admired Jackson, others thought that he was far too dictatorial in the way that he handled the bank and other matters. So a lot of people are now starting to witness the cruel hand of this president. I mean, he's putting his hand down and he's not allowing people to get up. And so a lot of people are basically picturing him and viewing him as a tyrant, such as King George, which is who we wanted to get away from. So now all of a sudden we're getting back into that horrible, horrible situation where we're feeling like we're being run around by a traitorous tyrant. Now, if you take a few minutes, you can read through the Acting as an Amateur Historian. And I also suggest that you take a few minutes and do the key events during Jackson's presidency, which is on page 207. Now, at this time, I'm 20 minutes in. This has been a long and enduring read. I will take my time, but I'm going to call quits at the moment. And I will bring back a second video later on. I'm going to stop here at the Industrial Revolution. It's been fun, and we'll recollect where we've left off in the next video. So until then, adios. I'm checking off.